Another thing I want you all to do with your essays is to go back and revisit your analysis. So say you've got your topic sentences down, they're progressing nicely. Now you think that you know how to progress your evidence as well. Like, I'm gonna make this point, then I'm gonna make this point, then I'm gonna make this point. Great. How are you actually writing the sentence of analysis? So you get a quote, you get a technique. Don't be afraid to go back to basics if you feel like the sentence or sentences for your analysis are too long. They're too verbose. And verbose means you're using too many words to convey the point. Don't be afraid to simplify it and go back to basics. I always start with a basic approach, okay? The basic approach is to have a technique, a quote, a verb such as reveals, and an effect where you explain the impact or the meaning behind that evidence. Okay? That's the starting point. I'm not saying that that's enough. I'm not saying that that's the final sentence of analysis, because there are one or two other things, two other steps really, to improve that to that band 6 level. But the first thing you need to do, and this is a really useful tip, does anyone feel like they story tell at times? Like they're describing what happens, but they're not analyzing what happens? If you feel like you are describing, or you've been told that by your teacher, here's the easiest thing you can do to stop doing that. Start with the technique at the start of the sentence, okay? I could bet that if you're having that problem, you don't always start with the technique at the start, because that means if you do lead with the technique, that you're then forced to provide the quote where that technique was present and explain its effect. Whereas if you don't lead with the technique, you might start kind of waffling on. You might go on a little rant and, oh, this happens, then this happens. Oh, this is exemplified by this. Whereas if you just go, the metaphor in this reveals this, you're analyzing, you're in an analytical mindset and framework. So the best fix I can recommend for you is to go through all of the sentences of analysis you currently have and rework them so the evidence comes first. Now, of course, the counter argument to that is to say, well, isn't that going to get really repetitive? Well, yes, I'm not suggesting to do it as the final product for every sentence. I'm saying it's a starting point. And you can also change how you start the sentence. So the technique, everyone just like write down an example. Everyone must have a technique on hand that they know they've used in an essay. Just literally write down now, the, THE, as you see in the diagram here, the metaphor, the personification, the simile, the whatever type of repetition, imagery, something, a technique that you know you've used. Write that down now. The, that. That's how simple it can be to get into the analysis. But it's very easy to overcomplicate it if you start by trying to describe things that happened. I'm not saying we won't include some references to things that happen. Again, it's a starting point. What are some other ways you can do it? Write down these other expressions to mix it up if you're not sure about them. So instead of just saying the metaphor, we can also say through the metaphor. Through the metaphor, comma, the composer illustrates this. So there'd have to be a comma if you do through the metaphor in this quote, comma. Just make sure if you're going to write through the technique, you have a comma after the quote. You can also say the, or instead of the, you can say the composer's name and say, I'm going to use Shakespeare as an example. Shakespeare's use of a metaphor in this reveals this. Everyone following? So there's like 3 different sentence starters that will give you a little bit of variation. But the idea here is to lead with the technique. The technique here could be a simple specific technique. We'll talk about having more sophisticated techniques, those macro techniques worked into the sentence as well. That's the basic structure we're going to be using. And here's an example. What technique can we see in this quote? He was a shell of himself. Okay, so this is imagine that's an extract from a novel. He was a shell of himself, and it's describing a person. Say it's describing a soldier coming back from war. It is a metaphor. So I'm just going to go through this to show an example. You've got your quote. You know that the quote links to the idea that you want to talk about in that paragraph. Oh, he was a shell of himself. I want to talk about the destructive effects of war. Let's say this was about war and it was a soldier. And it talked about a guy who came back from war. And it says, oh, he was a shell of himself. and it's characterizing this soldier. So we want to say the metaphor, again, just the starting point, you will end up with something different. The metaphor in he was a shell of himself reveals, and then we want to say something specific. Why would someone use that expression? You're a shell of yourself. When someone calls themselves a shell, they're saying you don't have the substance inside. So you've been emptied out. Richie says you've become empty. You adjust your physical body. Basically, you've lost your essence. It would mean that if you were to see that person, they have like lost that joy and that soul. It's like they've been traumatized, perhaps. What else would it say about your motivation and your morale? What would you say about it? That it's been what? It's been lost. It's been depleted. What we're going through here is an analysis of what this quote actually means. The more specific you can be about the effect of this, the higher band you're going to be in, right? You want to be band 6, you need to provide a specific thing that clearly relates to shell. Now, if we're calling someone a shell, we want to try and use a word associated with shell. The associated word was empty, because when you think of a shell, it's empty inside, isn't it? Notice how we've drawn a connection there, and then we're going to try and use that in the explanation. It reveals the extent to which the protagonist, assuming it's the main character, the protagonist's morale has been depleted. And have a look at this. Shell and depleted are similar in that a shell doesn't have anything inside, so it's been emptied out. If you deplete, you've run out of something. Can everyone see the connection between the word of the quote and the word we used in the explanation? The idea there is that the word you're using has something directly relevant to the key word of the quote. A lot of students do generic explanations of the quote. The way to avoid it, this is just one simple, very practical tip, is to find a word in the quote you've looked at and think of a synonym or a related term and use that in the explanation. Because you can't use the exact same word, can you? You wouldn't say he was a shell of himself, reveals the extent to which the protagonist became a shell of himself. But you can say something along those lines in different terms, and that shows the marker that you're interpreting the quote in a specific way. So all of those points earlier about how to be more specific, this is a really good one. Make sure you use a word in the explanation in the same sentence that will link directly to a key part of the quote, or maybe it links directly to the technique.